I have run the grief protocol 411 times. I want that number on the record before anything else. 411 subjects, across 9 species, over a career that spans 31 years at the Continuance Compliance and Integration Facility on Varithal Prime. I am not a junior analyst still learning the instrument. I wrote 2 of the 6 standard escalation modules currently in use. The protocol itself was designed around a truth that held across every species in our database. Grief is a wound, and wounds can be worked. A subject in active bereavement is a subject whose defenses are already open. You do not create the pressure, the loss creates it. You simply guide the subject toward the path you need them to walk. I believed that completely on the morning I opened the file for subject 47. The intake form was straightforward. Human male, 53 years of age, civilian designation, diplomatic liaison attached to the Earth Cohort's secondary trade mission. His wife had died 14 months prior. The cause was listed as a rapid onset pulmonary event, unforeseeable, no medical negligence. She had been his partner for 22 years. No children, no extended family in the system. The grief index on intake, assessed by our standard continuance scale, came back at 4.1 out of a possible 7, which placed him in the moderate to severe band. More than sufficient for protocol entry. I had worked subjects at 2.8 and seen them dissolve in the first session. I scheduled 4 sessions, standard spacing. I did not expect to need all 4. Session 1 I opened gently. That is always correct technique. The early sessions are not about force, they are about establishing the topography of the wound. I asked him about her. He answered. His voice was quiet and very steady, and he chose his words carefully in a way that suggested either practiced composure or a kind of distance from the material. I noted both possibilities in the log. I introduced the first resonance prompts, standard memorial imagery, ambient sound profiles known to activate bereavement recall in subjects with long-term bonded partnerships. His biometrics registered a clear response. Heart rate elevated. Cortical activity spiked in the pattern we associate with active grief recall. He was not suppressing. The wound was open. It was simply not behaving the way wounds behave. He said, near the end of the session, she would have found this room interesting. I asked what he meant. He said, the light, the way it comes in from the side like that. She was an architect, she noticed things like that. He looked at the light for a moment and then looked back at me, and his expression was not pained. It was something else. Something I did not have a classification for. I logged the session as incomplete and scheduled the escalation for Session 2. Session 2, I brought in the resonance amplifiers. This is not a subtle instrument. The Memorial Reconstruction Suite generates a composite environmental recreation using the subject's own biometric recall responses. It extrapolates an impression of the lost person from the involuntary signatures the subject's own physiology provides. I have watched hardened veterans disintegrate in this room. I have seen subjects who entered composed leave unable to speak. He sat in the center of the suite while the reconstruction resolved around him. It is never a perfect image. It is an impression, a shimmer, an outline, the weight of a presence assembled from everything the nervous system remembers without being asked to remember. When it stabilized around him, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Yes, that's right, that's her." He said it the way a person confirms something they already knew, not shaken, not unraveling. He sat with the impression for the full session duration, and when it dissolved, he thanked me. He actually thanked me. I asked him what he was feeling, and he thought about it for a moment and said, "Like I found something I'd misplaced. I knew it was still there. It's good to see it." I filed a formal escalation request that evening. I cited instrument irregularity. I believed I was dealing with an anomalous suppression mechanism, something deeply buried that the standard modules could not reach. My supervisor approved the full archive tier. Session 3. I used everything. The extended memorial reconstruction, the lost sequence narration, a structured recounting of the final days, drawn from the intake record, delivered in the subject's own language in a synthesized voice calibrated to resemble a neutral institutional authority. The bilateral sensory suite. The grief induction tonal array, which operates below conscious auditory threshold and has, in my experience, produced visible distress in subjects who entered the room convinced they were past their grief. He sat through all of it. At one point during the lost sequence narration, his eyes filled, not from breaking. I have seen subjects break, I know what it looks like. This was different. He listened to the narration the way a person listens to music they love, with attention, with something close to gratitude. When the narration reached the final day, he closed his eyes for a moment, and I watched his biometrics on the panel behind him. Heart rate elevated, steady, not spiking into distress. Cortical pattern, active recall, high resolution, sustained. He was not being overwhelmed. He was remembering deliberately, and the remembering seemed to be doing something for him rather than to him. He opened his eyes. He said, "We had 22 years. I'm not going to sit here and call that a wound." I did not log that immediately. I wrote it down by hand, which I have not done since my first year in the facility. Session 4. I came in with the full archive comparison, cross-species bereavement outcomes for subjects matched on loss profile, age, duration, absence of support network. Every comparable subject in our database had shown decisive protocol response within 3 sessions. The archive gave me a projected compliance curve for him. I showed it to him. I explained where he should be, statistically. I asked him directly why he thought the process was not having the intended effect. He looked at the curve for a while, then he said, "I think you're measuring the wrong thing." I asked what he meant. He said, "You're measuring the space where she isn't, but that's not where I'm keeping her." I had no follow-up question prepared. I have never not had a follow-up question. I sat across from a 53-year-old human man in a compliance suite designed to break grieving subjects, and I had nothing to say. He waited for me politely, and when I didn't speak, he said he hoped the sessions had been useful for my research, and he stood up, and he left. I filed the session report 3 hours later. The system flagged it automatically. Subject outcome unassigned. There is no field in the protocol report for what happened in that room. Compliance not achieved. Suppression mechanism not identified. Grief index on exit 4.1. Identical to intake. The instrument had spent 4 sessions attempting to widen a wound and found that the wound was also somehow the subject's foundation. I sent the report to the Institute's cross-species archive with a formal inquiry attached. I asked whether there was a classification for a bereavement state in which the loss had been fully absorbed into the subject's ongoing structure. Not resolved, not suppressed, not displaced, but integrated. Present, weight-bearing, and entirely stable. The archive came back in 6 days. There was no classification. There was a note from the senior methodology specialist, Dr. Privatsan, which read, "Not a gap in the subject's psychology, possibly a gap in the instrument. Recommend new category review." The review is pending. I do not know when it will conclude. What I know is this: 412 subjects. 1 outcome I cannot file. 1 species that carries its dead not as weight to be shed, but as structure to be stood on. Every protocol I have runs on the assumption that grief is a lever, that you find the wound and you work it until the subject moves where you need them to go. He did not move. Not because he wasn't grieving. He was. I could see it in the reconstruction suite, in the biometric panel, in the way he closed his eyes during the narration and breathed through it like a man doing something necessary and familiar. He was grieving completely. He was also, at the same moment, entirely present, entirely himself. The loss was in him the way bone is in a body, not a defect, not damage, architecture. I have reviewed the session recordings 11 times. I have not found the moment where I should have done something different. There is no such moment. The protocol worked exactly as it was designed to work. It simply ran against a species for whom grief is not an opening. I wrote 2 escalation modules. I intend to write a third. I do not yet know what it will do.